arrogant investor challenged Janitor's daughter to predict stock markets. Her accuracy was 99.7%. The marble floors of Whitmore Capital Management reflected the Manhattan skyline like a mirror of ambition. Every surface gleamed with the kind of polish that money could buy, the kind that Charles Winton had been buying for the last 43 years. At 68 years old, with silver hair perfectly coiffed and a net worth that exceeded most countries' GDPs, Charles had become something of a fixture in the financial world, the man who was never wrong, or so everyone believed. His office occupied the entire corner of the 42nd floor. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked Central Park, and his desk, an antique mahogany piece imported from London, held nothing but a single computer monitor and a leather portfolio. Charles believed in minimalism for appearances and maximalism for profit margins. He'd built his empire on 3 pillars: data, instinct, and an unshakable belief in his own superiority. "These people," he would often say during board meetings, gesturing vaguely toward the general population, "they're nothing but servants to the market. They don't understand that profit requires sacrifice. Their sacrifice, preferably." His analysts would laugh nervously. His competitors would listen carefully. His family had stopped listening years ago. Charles had been divorced 3 times. His first wife had left him after 5 years because she said he loved money more than he loved her. She was right. His second wife had stayed for 12 years, long enough to have 2 children, then left with a settlement that she'd use to open an art gallery in Santa Fe. She'd been happier on that day, Charles remembered, than he'd ever seen her during their marriage. His third wife had lasted only 3 years. She'd been an investment, he later realized, more than a relationship. A young woman meant to reflect his status, not actually share his life. He had 2 children, Margaret and Thomas. Margaret was 45 now, a therapist in Boston who specialized in helping wealthy people understand why their money couldn't buy them happiness. She'd written a book about her father without naming him, but everyone in the industry knew who she was writing about. Thomas was 42, a college professor who taught literature and had deliberately chosen a career path that would ensure he'd never be rich enough to impress his father. Charles had 4 grandchildren he'd never held. He received pictures on their birthdays and Christmas, printed out by assistants and placed on his desk for the appropriate amount of time before being filed away. But he had money, incomprehensible amounts of it, and in his mind, that was the only currency that mattered. That was the fundamental error of his life, though he wouldn't understand it for several more years. The cleaning staff had strict instructions written in a memo that Charles had personally approved: never look directly at senior management, never speak unless spoken to, never pause in your work to accommodate meetings or conversations, and never, under any circumstances, touch anything on a desk or in a work area without explicit permission. The head custodian, Maria Santos, had worked at Whitmore for 18 years. She knew the rules better than most lawyers knew contract law. She'd memorized them on her first day and had never once violated them. Maria was 51 years old, though she looked older. The years of physical labor had carved lines into her face and bent her spine slightly forward in a posture of permanent deference. Her hands were rough from chemicals and constant exposure to water. She had 2 daughters, one who had died at age 4 from leukemia, and one who was alive, thriving, and somehow entirely different from the world her mother inhabited. That daughter was named Lena Santos, and she was 17 years old when this story truly begins. Lena was taller than her mother by 4 inches, with the kind of natural beauty that no amount of poverty could diminish. She had her mother's dark eyes and her mother's sharp cheekbones, but her father's fair complexion, a combination that had come from a man named David Mitchell, who had worked as a translator at the United Nations and had appeared in Maria's life for exactly 3 months before he disappeared back into whatever shadow he'd emerged from. He'd left her pregnant and heartbroken, and then he'd left her alone. Lena had inherited his blonde hair and his blue eyes, features that somehow seemed at odds with her darker complexion, creating an unusual beauty that made people look twice. It was a beauty that sometimes made her stand out in ways that made her deeply uncomfortable. In the hallways of Whitmore Capitol, where she was invisible as a shadow most of the time, that beauty occasionally made her hypervisible in ways that felt dangerous. After school each day, Lena would come to the Whitmore building and help her mother with the evening cleaning shift. While other teenagers were at parties or studying in libraries or scrolling through social media on expensive phones, Lena was pushing a mop across the halls of a financial empire, emptying trash cans filled with the rejected ideas of millionaires, wiping down counters in break rooms where she would never be welcome as anything other than labor. But unlike most people in her position, Lena saw opportunity where others saw only servitude. She saw the discarded materials as a curriculum. She saw the spaces between tasks as moments for learning. She saw the invisible world of finance that surrounded her as something not to fear, but to understand. She'd discovered the break room on the 23rd floor purely by accident on a Tuesday in October of her junior year. Her mother had asked her to help with a particularly intense cleaning session. Someone had spilled coffee on the carpets in 3 separate rooms, and while her mother was dealing with the carpet cleaners, Lena was taking out the trash. It was rarely used, this break room, and someone had left behind a folder of printed stock reports on the table. Someone important had left them there and forgotten them. Lena's first instinct was to throw them away. Her second instinct was to read them. She'd opened the folder with the reverence of someone opening an ancient text. The papers were covered in graphs and numbers, company names, and projected earnings. There were handwritten notes in the margins, notes that seemed to be arguing with the conclusions of the professional analysts. "This is wrong," one note read. "They're not accounting for the supply chain disruption. Look at the shipping indexes." Another simply said, "Bull trap. Sell." Lena had sat down at that table, still wearing her work uniform with its faint stains of cleaning chemicals, and she'd read every single page. She'd read them slowly, carefully, trying to understand what she was seeing. Some of it made sense. Most of it didn't. But the questions it generated in her mind were beautiful and complex. When she got home that night, she'd done something terrifying. She'd asked her mother about stocks. "Why are you asking me this?" her mother had said, stirring a pot of rice and beans, the smell filling their small apartment. "Mija, you can't waste time on things like that. We don't have money to invest. We need money to survive." "I'm just curious," Lena had said. "I want to understand." Her mother had looked at her with an expression that mixed love and concern, and she'd said something that Lena would never forget. "Curiosity is a luxury for people with time." don't waste yours on things that won't put food on the table. But Lena couldn't stop. She began her self-education quietly, secretly, in the spaces between her shifts. She'd found the abandoned newspapers in the recycling bins, Wall Street Journal, Financial Times, Investor's Business Daily, and she'd taken them home, reading them by lamplight in her bedroom until late at night. She'd discovered that the public library had free access to financial databases. She'd invested in a battered Dell laptop that cost her 2 months of saved allowance, purchased from a used electronics store in Queens. The screen had a crack that ran diagonally across it, and the keyboard was missing the letter K, which was frustrating until she learned to work around it. What started as curiosity became obsession. While her mother cleaned bathrooms on the 35th floor, Lena sat in the cafeteria with her cracked screen phone, a refurbished iPhone 6 that barely held a charge, and she watched YouTube videos about technical analysis. She found channels run by independent traders, autodidacts, who had taught themselves the market the same way she was teaching herself. She read free financial blogs, accessed through the public Wi-Fi that the Whitmore building inadvertently broadcast into the lobby. She studied the patterns in market data that she copied into a worn notebook, one of those composition books you could buy for 49 cents at any pharmacy. She taught herself about market cycles, reading about the theories of Elliott wave analysis until her eyes burned with exhaustion. She learned how to read between the lines of corporate announcements, understanding that words like restructuring and strategic realignment often meant layoffs and desperation. She taught herself to recognize the subtle signals that separated winners from losers, the way a CEO's voice changed during an earnings call when discussing problem areas, the way certain companies consistently beat expectations by narrow margins, suggesting forward guidance was deliberately conservative, the way certain industries were vulnerable to disruption that nobody was talking about yet. No one at Whitmore Capital knew about Lena's education. No one cared about the janitor's daughter scribbling numbers in a notebook during her mother's breaks. She was invisible, and invisibility had given her an unexpected gift: the ability to observe without being observed, to listen without being heard, to gather intelligence in plain sight, because no one believed she was intelligent enough to be gathering anything at all. The mockery came eventually, as it always does. One of the junior analysts, a man named Derek Hastings, who was 26 years old and already making more than Lena's mother made in 5 years, saw her with her notebook in the break room. He'd come in looking for the espresso machine and found her instead, her face illuminated by the glow of her phone, her hand moving rapidly across the page of her notebook. He'd laughed so hard that he'd had to grip the edge of the counter to stay upright. "Oh, my God," he'd said, loud enough to draw the attention of several colleagues. "The cleaning girl thinks she can predict stocks." "Hey, Mama," he'd called out, finding Maria in the hallway. "Maybe they should hire your daughter. You could both get rich together." Maria had simply smiled and continued wiping down the counters. She'd learned long ago that the best response to mockery was no response at all. Lena had said nothing as well. She'd learned from her mother that sometimes silence was the most powerful response to ignorance, that drawing attention was dangerous for people like them, that the safest path was to remain invisible. But Charles Winton, for all his flaws, was not someone to ignore anything for long. It happened on a Thursday afternoon in early March, on a day when the first real warmth of spring was beginning to penetrate the chill of winter that had gripped New York for 4 months. Charles had stayed late at the office. He rarely did anymore. His instincts usually worked better than any extra research ever could, and he found himself restless. At 68, he was beginning to notice that sleep didn't come as easily as it once had, that his mind seemed to wake at 3 in the morning with worries and calculations that wouldn't stop until dawn. He'd stayed late today thinking that perhaps exhaustion would help. He was walking through the break room on the 42nd floor, a place he'd only been once before, out of morbid curiosity to see what the staff ate and drank, when he heard a soft voice. It was not loud. In fact, it was barely above a whisper. But there was such certainty in it that it cut through the ambient noise of the building like a blade through silk. "Steel Ridge Industries is going to collapse," the voice said. "Within 3 months, maybe less. They're hiding debt. You can see it in the SEC filings if you know where to look. They're trying to restructure before anyone notices, but the numbers don't add up." Charles froze. He turned slowly, taking in the sight of the young woman. Thin, wearing a uniform that marked her as custodial staff, her blonde hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, her fingers moving across the pages of a worn notebook. She was speaking to an older woman, her mother, Charles realized, recognizing the features, who was wiping down the refrigerator. "I've run the numbers 3 times," the young woman continued. "I've cross-referenced with their subsidiary reports, looked at the accounts receivable. They have a $40 million liability that they're distributing across 7 different accounting categories. It's sophisticated, but it's not sophisticated enough. Someone with the right knowledge will find it within the quarter. When they do, the stock is going to drop 30, maybe 40%. Charles felt something cold move through his chest. This was not a conversation he should be hearing. This was not analysis that should exist outside of his analytics department, performed by people he paid millions of dollars per year to perform exactly this function. "You," he said, his voice cutting through the air like a blade. Lena looked up, startled. Her blue eyes met his, and Charles saw something he hadn't expected to see in the face of a cleaning staff member. Intelligence. Pure, unfiltered, hard-won intelligence. "I'm sorry," she said quietly, her instinct to apologize, to minimize herself, to become even smaller than she already was. "You think Steel Ridge is going to collapse?" His tone was mockingly kind, the tone an adult uses with a child who has just suggested something adorably foolish. "Do you have any idea how many billions are riding on that company's stability? Do you know how many of my analysts have studied this? How many PhDs have pored over their financials and come to entirely different conclusions?" "No," Lena said simply. She put her pencil down, and Charles noticed that her hand was trembling slightly. "I don't know, but I know the numbers." Charles laughed. The sound was sharp, dismissive, the laugh of a man accustomed to being right about everything, of being the smartest person in every room he entered. "The numbers," he repeated, as though this were the most amusing thing he'd heard all week. "My dear child, I've been reading numbers for 43 years. I've made more money from numbers than most people earn in a lifetime. I've forgotten more about market analysis than you'll ever learn. You're what, 15? 16? 17, Lena said quietly. She met his eyes again, and there was no defiance in her gaze, only steadiness. "Even more tragic," Charles said. He pulled out his business card, a thick, cream-colored piece of stock that probably cost more per unit than Lena's weekly salary. The card was embossed with his name, his titles, his importance. Here's what we're going to do. You're going to predict the market movement for next week, all of it, every major index. And when you're spectacularly wrong, when you realize that you're out of your depth and that people like me exist for a reason, maybe you'll understand the value of knowing when to stay in your lane. He turned to Maria, and his expression softened slightly, though it never lost its fundamental condescension. You're a good custodian, Santos. One of the best. Don't let your daughter's delusions of grandeur ruin that. We have plans to expand our outsourcing next year, and we need reliable people in place. Your reliability is valuable to us. It was a threat, though one wrapped in the language of compliment. Keep your daughter in line or risk losing your position. That was what he was really saying, and then he left, taking his superiority with him. Lena looked at the card in her hand, studying it with the reverence of someone holding an artifact from a foreign civilization. She turned it over slowly, tracing the embossed letters with her thumb. Her mother put a hand on her shoulder. "Don't," Maria said softly. "Please, just don't. People like him, they don't respect people like us. They respect fear. They respect knowing your place." But Lena was already thinking about Steel Ridge. She was already thinking about the numbers she'd seen in those financial reports, the inconsistencies that nobody else seemed to notice. She was thinking about the $40 million moving through the accounting system like water through a sieve, and she was thinking about the fact that Charles Winton, for all his arrogance, had left her with a challenge. She couldn't resist challenges. They were the only thing that made her life feel like something other than survival. It began on Monday with a whisper, rumors on Reddit and other financial forums about Steel Ridge Industries, something about a whistleblower coming forward. By Wednesday, the rumors had become news. By Friday, the news had become a scandal. A former Steel Ridge accountant, someone named Patricia Chen, who had been working in their finance department for 7 years, had gone to the SEC with documentation of systematic accounting fraud. The company had been hiding liabilities, exactly as Lena had predicted, exactly $40 million, distributed exactly as she had described, through exactly the accounting categories she had identified. Steel Ridge Industries fell 14% in a single day. Within a week, it had fallen 42%. The stock collapsed to a fraction of its former value. 5 hedge funds that had heavily invested in the company lost millions. The financial news erupted with scandal and recrimination. News anchors debated how the fraud had gone undiscovered for so long. Regulatory bodies began investigations. CEOs were interrogated, and Lena, sitting in the cafeteria with her cracked phone and her worn notebook, had predicted every single movement with mathematical precision. But there was more. Over the following 3 weeks, she made additional predictions. She predicted that TechVision would announce disappointing earnings because she'd analyzed their hiring patterns and realized they were firing before they announced restructuring. She predicted that Meridian Pharmaceuticals' drug trial would fail before any news was publicly announced, based on subtle changes in the language their executives used during investor calls. She predicted that a small regional bank would face deposit runs because she'd noticed unusual movement in their collateral valuations. All 3 predictions came true. Her accuracy wasn't just impressive, it was statistically impossible. According to every model that had ever been created to measure the probability of successful market prediction, what Lena was doing shouldn't be possible. Charles Winton didn't say anything immediately, but Lena noticed him watching her after that. She'd be in the break room, and he'd appear, ostensibly for coffee he didn't drink, asking in the vague way of executives for information about whether the break room needed anything. He was checking on her. He was trying to understand her. The fourth prediction came in late April. Lena had been studying the financial reports for a major real estate investment trust, CRII they were called, and she'd identified a pattern in their property valuations. She'd found that they were systematically overvaluing properties in certain markets, inflating their portfolio value to support higher dividend payments than their actual earnings justified. She'd predicted the collapse with dates and percentages. "It's going to happen in May," she'd told her mother. "Probably around the 15th. Someone's going to challenge their valuations, and the whole structure is going to collapse." Charles had overheard this conversation. He'd happened to be in the break room again, and he'd been standing by the window, ostensibly looking at the view but actually listening to every word. The call came to his office later that day. It was from a journalist at Bloomberg who'd been investigating KREI. They'd found evidence that the company was systematically overvaluing assets. They wanted Charles's comment as one of the largest institutional investors in the fund. Charles made a decision that changed everything. He liquidated his CREI position and sold short a portion of it, betting against the company. On May 14th, the company announced a revaluation. On May 15th, the stock fell exactly as Lena had predicted. Charles made $37 million on that trade. That evening, he called Lena into his office. She was terrified as she rode the elevator to the 42nd floor. She wore her school uniform, having come directly from class. She'd gotten a call during lunch from her mother saying that Mr. Winton wanted to see her. Her mind had immediately gone to dark places. Had she done something wrong? Was he going to fire her mother? Was he going to take some kind of revenge for the embarrassment of her predictions being correct? The office was exactly as she'd imagined it would be, cold, perfect, and utterly without warmth. The floor was polished to such a shine that you could see yourself in it. The furniture was expensive in a way that screamed, "Don't touch." The art on the walls was abstract and probably worth more than Lena's entire life. "Sit," he said, not unkindly. She sat. For a long moment, Charles said nothing. He simply studied her, his gray eyes moving across her face as though trying to read her like one of his precious financial reports. She was 17 years old, wearing a school uniform that had been washed so many times it was beginning to fray at the edges. Her blonde hair was neatly pulled back. Her blue eyes were fixed on the desk in front of her, carefully not meeting his gaze. "How?" he finally asked. "How what?" Lena said, her voice barely above a whisper. "How are you doing this? You have no training, no resources, no access to anything beyond what you can find for free online. You're a child. You should be worrying about prom and college applications and whatever it is that people your age worry about. How are you predicting the market with 99.7% accuracy?" Lena had thought about how to answer this question many times, preparing in her mind for the moment when someone important would ask it. She'd prepared several responses, various ways to explain pattern recognition and data analysis, and the ways that human psychology repeated itself in predictable cycles. She'd thought about explaining technical analysis and fundamental analysis, about the power of observation and the importance of listening to what the numbers were actually saying rather than what people hoped they would say. But looking at Charles Winton in his expensive office, at the vulnerability in his old eyes despite the authority in his posture, she decided to tell him the truth instead of the rehearsed answer. "I'm not doing anything special," she said. "I'm just reading what's there. Most people don't want to see it, so they don't. But it's always there. The signs, the patterns, the truth. It's like when you know a person really well, you can tell when they're lying just by the way they hold their shoulders, the way their breathing changes, the way their eyes move. The market is like that too. It has tells. Most people are too busy talking to listen to what it's actually saying." Charles leaned back in his chair. "You've never had any formal education in finance?" "No," Lena said. "I've read everything free I could find. I've taught myself. I watched videos. I read financial reports. I listened to earnings calls." Why? This was the question Lena had been dreading, because the answer was so simple, so pure, so utterly at odds with everything Charles understood about motivation and incentive and the nature of human ambition. "My mother works here," Lena said, finally looking up to meet his eyes. "And the company has been talking about cutting the custodial staff. They mentioned it last month. I heard them talking in the hallway when my mother and I were cleaning. Someone said something about outsourcing and cost reduction. If I could make money somehow, maybe they wouldn't have to fire her. Maybe she could stop working so hard. Maybe she could rest." Charles felt something then, something he hadn't felt in a very long time. It was a sensation so foreign to him that he almost didn't recognize it at first. It was a sensation that his therapist had tried to help him understand for years, a sensation that his children had begged him to develop, a sensation that had been absent from his life for so long that it had become almost mythological, more concept than feeling. It was shame, deep, profound, life-altering shame. It moved through him like a sickness, and he gripped the edge of his desk to anchor himself in the present moment. He looked at this girl, 17 years old, living on nothing, teaching herself finance in the spaces between her mother's cleaning shifts because she wanted to help her mother, because she wanted to spare her from being discarded by an industry that measured human worth in efficiency metrics. And he saw everything he'd spent his life running away from. He saw kindness. He saw purpose beyond profit. He saw a human being instead of a transaction. He looked at her for a long time without speaking. Then he said something that surprised both of them. "I want to hire you as an intern. You'll work in my department analyzing market data with my team. We'll pay you $20 an hour, and you'll work 20 hours a week around your school schedule." "I can't," Lena said immediately. "I need to help my mother with her shift. I need to be there when she—" "Then we'll adjust it," Charles interrupted. "Early morning sessions, before school or weekends or both. We'll make it work. We'll be flexible." "Why?" Lena asked. "You made fun of me. You challenged me just to prove that I was wrong." "Because," Charles said slowly, choosing his words with care, "I'm tired of being right. I'm tired of building an empire that doesn't mean anything, and I want to understand how you do this thing that should be impossible. I want to learn from you." The next 6 months transformed Whitmore Capital Management in ways both subtle and profound. They transformed Charles Winton in ways that nobody, including Charles himself, would have thought possible. Lena began working in the analyst's bullpen, a space she'd once only seen from the hallway while pushing a mop, a space where important-looking men and women sat at desks surrounded by multiple monitors, moving money around the world with a few keystrokes. She was the youngest person there by 2 decades, and certainly the only one who had recently cleaned the bathrooms. The other analysts didn't know how to treat her at first. She was neither fully staff nor fully intern, neither friend nor rival, neither subordinate because of her accuracy, nor superior because of her age and lack of credentials. She arrived in the mornings before school, wearing her uniform under her jacket, and left at 7 a.m. sharp to make it to class by first period. She returned in the afternoons and worked until 6 p.m., then went home to help her mother. But after her first prediction proved correct, and then her second, and then every single one thereafter, something shifted. The analysts began to gather around her, asking questions, trying to understand her methodology. Senior executives from other departments began stopping by, wanting to introduce themselves, wanting to be associated with the source of Whitmore's increasingly legendary success. Within 2 months, the entire analytics department had reorganized itself around Lena's insights. She wasn't the manager. She was still an intern, still technically a student, but everyone understood that she was the center around which everything rotated. What the analysts discovered was that Lena didn't have a traditional methodology. She had intuition based on deep data analysis. She could absorb financial reports the way others absorb novels, pulling out the emotional truth beneath the numbers. She understood that markets were fundamentally human, driven by hope and fear, by greed and panic, by the collective unconscious desires of millions of people making simultaneous decisions, and that if you understood human nature, you could understand where money would flow. Charles became her mentor, but he was learning more from her than she from him. He'd built his fortune on the belief that the market was a predictable machine, that it operated according to rational principles, that human emotion was a variable to be controlled rather than a fundamental force to be understood. Lena showed him that it was something far more complex, a living organism, breathing with the collective consciousness of millions of people making simultaneous decisions, guided by fears and hopes rather than pure logic. They began having daily sessions, sometimes in his office, sometimes in the break room where it had all started, sometimes in coffee shops near the financial district where they could talk without being overheard. He would quiz her on positions, and she would walk him through her thinking. He would play devil's advocate, challenging her conclusions, and she would defend them with the calm certainty of someone who had already verified them against every possible variable. But something unexpected happened during these sessions. Charles began to change in ways that went far beyond financial strategy. The arrogance that had defined him for decades started to crack like ancient ice under spring sun. He began asking Lena about her life, really asking, not in the cursory way of someone making conversation, but in the deep way of someone genuinely wanting to understand. He learned that her father had been nothing, just a man named David Mitchell, who had passed through her life like a comet, leaving only his genetics behind. David had worked as a UN translator, moving between languages and cultures with ease, never staying anywhere long enough to develop roots. He'd been in New York for a consulting job, had met Maria at a conference where her company had been cleaning afterward, had fallen into something that felt like love for 3 months, and then had disappeared back to his traveling life without leaving a forwarding address. He learned that her mother had never married, never even attempted to date seriously again after David left, had instead poured all of her love and attention into raising Lena, protecting her, insulating her from the poverty that tried to claim them both. He learned about the part of Lena's childhood he would never have imagined: the food banks, the community health clinics, the moments when her mother had gone without meals so that Lena could eat, the way Lena had learned early that love expressed itself in sacrifice. He learned about the moment when Lena had realized that her mother was working herself to death, literally killing herself through labor to provide for her child. He learned about the night when Lena had decided that she would teach herself something valuable, something that could be monetized, something that could change their circumstances. He learned about the solitude of that education, the shame of scribbling notes in the break room while others mocked her, the fear that she was wasting time on something impossible, the way she had pushed forward anyway because the alternative, accepting their poverty as permanent, was unthinkable. And through these conversations, Charles felt his entire understanding of the world shifting. He began to understand that what he'd always believed to be weakness, emotion, connection, caring about people, was actually the source of profound strength. He began to understand that his divorces hadn't happened to him because of bad luck, but because he'd constructed his entire identity around becoming someone his partners couldn't love. He began to understand that his children hadn't abandoned him, he'd abandoned them. He'd done it years ago, when he decided that making money was more important than making memories, that accumulating wealth mattered more than accumulating relationships. One day, about 4 months into Lena's internship, he called his daughter, Margaret. He hadn't called her in 3 years. "Dad?" she said, and he could hear the shock in her voice, followed quickly by a wall of professional distance, the tone she probably used in therapy sessions with other wealthy people damaged by their relationships with money. "I want to see you," he said, "and Thomas, and the grandchildren. I want to know them. I want to know you. I think I finally understand why you both left. I want to understand it better." There was a long silence. Then Margaret had said, "Okay, Dad, okay. Come to Boston this weekend. I'll tell Thomas. We'll see what we can arrange." That weekend, Charles Winton spent time with his family for the first time in years. He met his grandchildren, who were strangers to him, and he apologized to his daughter for being absent from her life. He apologized to his son for being dismissive of his career choices. He told them about Lena, about learning from a teenager who'd had to teach herself what it meant to find purpose beyond profit. Margaret cried. Thomas opened up in ways he hadn't in years. And Charles began the long, difficult process of becoming the person he should have been all along. When Charles returned to New York, he called a company-wide assembly. The announcement came down through the ranks. All staff, all departments, everyone who worked in the Whitmore Capitol building was requested to attend. It was unusual enough that rumors began immediately. Was the company being sold? Was there a merger? Was Whitmore going public? Lena was nervous. She'd been included in the planning. Charles had asked her opinion about what he was planning to do, which made her the only person in the entire company who knew what was about to happen. She stood at the back of the auditorium with her mother, both of them uncertain about the role they would play in whatever was about to unfold. Maria had asked her daughter repeatedly if she knew what this was about, And Lena had kept the secret, respecting Charles's wishes, but also feeling the weight of that knowledge. Charles took the stage, and the arrogance was still there. It was part of him, part of his fundamental nature. But it was different now. It was tempered. It had been refined in the fires of shame and sadness, and the slow recognition that a life built on superiority was a life built on sand. "I've been thinking about something," he began, "about value, about what we measure and what we ignore. In this industry, we measure profit. We measure returns on investment. We measure the increase in our portfolios while the world outside these walls decreases in security and stability. We measure efficiency in terms of cost reduction. We measure success by our ability to do more with less, to extract more value with fewer resources." He paused, and his eyes found Maria's in the crowd. "And in doing this, we've developed a category of people that we call non-essential personnel. We have administrators and executives. We have analysts and managers. And we have the people who keep this building functioning, the people who clean our bathrooms and empty our trash, who keep the infrastructure of our success in place while we sit in our offices and count our money." The room was absolutely silent now. You could hear the air conditioning humming through the vents. "I'm 68 years old," Charles said, "and I've just realized, in the last few months, something that should have been obvious to me decades ago. The people who clean our bathrooms are not less valuable than I am. They are not less worthy of respect. They are not servants to my ambition." He continued, "We were planning to cut the custodial staff. We were going to outsource the job to a cheaper contractor to improve our profit margins by approximately 2.3%. Today, I'm announcing that we're doing something very different. We're cutting the custodial staff in half, in terms of the number of people required to work here. The other half is being promoted to building maintenance specialists, with a 20% salary increase and full benefits including health insurance, retirement plans, and paid vacation time. We've been getting $3 worth of dignity and respect from people we've been paying like they're worth 30 cents. That ends today." His eyes found Maria once more. There were tears in the older woman's eyes. "Your services are invaluable. You've been invaluable. From this moment on, you'll be treated that way, effective immediately." He turned his attention to the rest of the company. "I'm also announcing the creation of the Winton Scholarship Fund, which will provide full educational opportunities to the children of our support staff. Not just Whitmore Capital staff, but anyone working in facilities, maintenance, and support roles at our offices. I'm personally endowing it with $50 million, and I expect our senior executives to contribute as well. We have a responsibility to invest in people, not just markets." His eyes found Lena's. She felt tears running down her face, though she didn't remember starting to cry. Because sometimes the greatest investment returns don't come in dollars. They come in the form of a young woman who teaches an old man that he's been measuring success by the wrong metrics. Sometimes they come in the form of recognizing that the person mopping your floor might be the most brilliant person in your building. Sometimes they come in understanding that true wealth isn't measured in net worth. It's measured in the quality of the relationships we've built and the impact we've had on the lives of people around us.